Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about why progressivism is the death of good storytelling, and especially for people who are used to high continuity, very intricate stories, which if you lived through the 80s and the 90s, 70s, 80s or 90s, that connection of high continuity, very intricate stories was what you cut your teeth on, was what was presented to you over and over again. And to some extent, this is why such a contrast exists between what has existed as stories and what exists now as so called storytelling under your progressive systems, quote unquote, progressive systems of entertainment. And I want to get down right into the weeds about why this very massive disconnect exists and thus why your quote unquote progressive people cannot write a good story. But very briefly, if you are someone who is looking for a new story that is constructed according to those old ideals, a story that is intricate and well connected, I have two links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels. There are 2 superhero graphic novels and 1 return to form for low fantasy. You're looking at some of the beautiful art for those graphic novels in the background. They are stories that center around death and honor and true heroism. And if you want a little bit more of a taste of what one of the stories is like, I play a trailer for one of my graphic novels at the end of my videos. And if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and see if one of my graphic novels is for you. But back to the topic. Now, I've actually talked about this topic a number of times before, so why am I talking about it again? Well, I ran across a video which really explained in depth something I had not quite considered before about your quote unquote progressive ideology. And right off the bat, I'll have to tell you, here's the thing. It is a political discussion, but it has a vast impact on your quote unquote progressive entertainment system. Why? Because progressivism is based upon the idea that everything is social, including reality itself. Everything, including reality, is a social construct. And how does that social construct come to be? It comes to be through political power. Therefore, since everything, including reality itself, is based upon political power, then yes, if we're talking about anything that progressives do, that includes storytelling, we must involve a political discussion. Although when I say political, I mean the roots of political ideas. So the video that I watched was from a channel called, I do believe, Trigonometry. Now, I don't follow that channel, but I do know of them. I've seen them around. And you have 2 guys who are basically traditional liberals talking to a progressive fellow, a fairly well-known progressive fellow, and they ask him to define what a woman is. And it starts off as a very cordial exchange and devolves from there, but I want to focus on the cordial part of the entire video where the quote-unquote progressive guy is not getting triggered, not yet, and he's discussing what he sees as the definition of a woman. And I don't care about the whole woman thing, how he defines it. I care about what his qualifications are for defining things, because that plays into how progressives use language, and language is how stories are told. So the 2 classical liberal guys are trying to pin him down, saying, well, we need to have an actual definition for it, whereas the quote unquote progressive fellow keeps on saying, no, you see, the definition for this word changes according to every different situation that you're in. Now, when I heard that, something really clicked in my brain. I had never really heard a quote unquote progressive person express it exactly in this way. That definitions themselves change according to every separate situation that they're in. And this is an extremely telling thing for someone to come out and say. Now, I know they do it all the time, but to come out and say, this is what we do when we discuss things with other people, and it's a systematized way of doing it, that makes a difference. But before we get into that difference itself, I want to take a step back and look at this discussion itself of this quote unquote progressive guy discussing things with these 2 traditional liberals. Now, as a conservative person, I would say that both of these sides, liberals and progressives, are 2 sides of one coin. And I know a lot of people listening to me will not agree with that. But here's how I break down that kind of a qualification. And honestly, the funny thing is, looking at that qualification, I can see why liberal people, traditional liberal people, can actually write a good kind of story. I think it limits and sometimes hampers their ability to tell good stories, but they can tell good stories, whereas your progressive people cannot. But the thing is that traditional liberals share with progressives an idea of a redefinition of one specific word at least. And it is a redefinition of a word that conservatives would think the exact opposite about. And that word is liberty. In a conservative mindset, liberty has its own definition. It is a part of something objective, and that leads to the entire mindset of a conservative, which is a bit counterintuitive. It is the idea that if you truly wish to have liberty, if you truly wish to be free, you need to make yourself a servant of the truth. Why? Well, because the entire universe is governed according to very specific rules of reality, true rules of reality, and the only way that you can actually accomplish anything is to act in accord with those rules. If you try to act in opposition to the rules, the fundamental rules of reality, you're just going to become a prisoner of whatever lie it is that you're operating under. Because, as I always say, reality is simply going to smack you to the ground, saying, can't do that. But liberty, for both the liberal and the progressive, and I'm talking in the abstract way according to the ideologies, their definition of liberal is very different, and we don't even have to look at their definition of liberal. It is the fact that they believe that they, as individuals, can define what liberty is for themselves. Now, I'm going to adopt the conservative position and show why the kinds of storytellings from liberals and then progressives more thoroughly have a problem according to such a mindset, and I'm going to do so because our tradition of storytelling for minimum 2,000 years, I would say almost 3,000 years, is one wherein the basis is to define a story as A, a rhetorical argument, and B, a reflection of reality. Or to put it another way, story as a thing in itself, as a construct, is defined logically, and the basis of logic is that you don't get to define certain things yourself. That is the very first rule of logic. It is that a thing is what it is. So the ideas of logic and of storytelling within our history follow a very conservative pattern in saying that no, liberty is what it is. You don't get to define for yourself what it is. But again, it is that mechanism of redefining which must be focused on. Because for the liberal, they redefine pretty much only one thing, and that is what liberty is. And then, according to this mindset, which says that's untrue, errors spread out from that and can balloon. But your progressive person says, no, I can redefine everything I want, every word I use at any point. Now, the reason why a classical liberal can tell a good story and a progressive cannot is because logic has within it a mechanism of what if. Let's construct an argument according to a what if statement, an if then statement. And so if you're just redefining one thing, yeah, you can tell a story according to that, saying if X, then Y. So let's construct an argument on the assumption that this statement is true, if X, then Y. And so classical liberals start with what conservatives would see as a non-truth, the ability to redefine this idea for themselves and say, if that's true, then let's see what plays out according to the story. And yes, that can be an interesting thought experiment, that can be an interesting logical argument, and therefore that can be an interesting story. The problem there with it limiting what a liberal storyteller can do, and sometimes hampering what a liberal storyteller can do, is when they have no idea that they're basing their entire system of ideas to tell a story upon such an if-then statement. So a liberal story, in my opinion, would have very great effect if the writer acknowledges, either consciously or unconsciously, that yes, they're limiting themselves to this kind of if-then statement, and then following after that the normal rules of argumentation, because again, a story is a rhetorical argument, and then following those rules in order to, again, reflect reality, and thus the reader sees it as a very good reflection of reality. Things like continuity have meaning, at the very least within that system that is created, and things can be intricate and complex and make sense. But the problem, again, is when they don't recognize that and believe that it's actually true, and therefore errors balloon off of that in their ability to tell a story. And those errors, again, usually express themselves in ways which most of us just think of as bad storytelling, but are things that affect continuity, things that affect how the book is edited, how the story is edited. Because editing does depend, if you're doing story editing as well as copy editing, upon ideas, normal ideas of how human beings work, how reality works, all that kind of thing. Now, in order to get into the further discussion of how quote unquote progressive storytellers can't even come close to even what a traditional liberal can do in order to create a good story, we have to look at the reason why. Why do both sides actually want to redefine this very specific thing? It is quite simply to enter equivocation into a system of interacting with other people. And yes, I would say even traditional liberals do this. If they can redefine what liberty is halfway through an argument, because that's the point. It's not that they redefine it as very specific and something different than a conservative does. It's that they base their redefinition on the fact that they, as personal individuals, can redefine it whenever they want, according to their own personal experience. They can skip out on the very basis of logic itself as long as they retreat to this word, because this word, liberty, will allow them to enter equivocation into the argument itself, and therefore the argument is no longer rational, no longer logical, and they have the ability to win the argument, so-called, through this kind of sophistry and present their argument as actually being true when the entire thing is simply based upon, once again, sophistry. Sophistry being, in layman's terms, manipulating, well, basically language in order to appear like your weak argument is triumphant over a stronger argument. And the reason why they do this is quite simply because you can't redefine liberty according to personal taste. It is a thing which exists. It is a concept which has strict definitions according to reality, and if you try to redefine it that way, it is an error. An error according to logic. Because again, the very first rule of logic is a thing is what it is. You have to have one very specific definition of what a thing is, and if your definition is wrong, we can apply that definition to the rules of other reality around us and see whether or not it is right or wrong. Those are actually the first two steps of logic itself. Simple apprehension and judgment. Simple apprehension being to define a thing as it is. Judgment is to compare that thing with the other things around it and judge whether or not that definition is true. So at its heart, I would say both liberalism and progressivism have a weak spot. And that weak spot is how they define what liberty is. And again, not just their definition of liberty, but how they define what liberty is. And since that weak spot must be defended at all cost, it must be ignored when you have any real, hearty, rational, and logical argument. You must throw out red herrings whenever someone gets close to it because you don't want them to see that it's actually false. That one point you have to protect above all else. And you do that, of course, through equivocation. That is to say, redefining things according to your ability to redefine them, which is the central point of redefining liberty, so that every argument you make can be bent towards people believing the, well, basically lie that is at the heart of those ideologies. So let me try to break that down in a more simplistic way. There are basically two sides of the fence. One side of the fence, which is the conservative idea that, I'm sorry, but if you want to be free, you must first be a servant. That's the only way you can be, at the very least, as free as possible, to be a servant to reality. The liberal idea, which progressivism is an extreme extension of the liberal idea, is to say, no, I don't want to serve at all. Therefore, in order to make an argument that I don't have to serve, I have to destroy the very basis and foundation of logic itself, not for a classical liberal completely and utterly, but just in a way wherein I enter at the very least one point of equivocation which can be retreated to so that I can get out of any corner that I get logically pinned down into. But for the progressive person, they say, no, we can redefine every word that we use according to every different situation that we are in, which is to say, we use equivocation constantly, redefining words. Why? So that we can win the argument, even though that quote unquote winning of the argument is simply sophistry at play. And to bring it all back to storytelling, if you can do that, if you believe that you can do that you can redefine any word that you use at any moment, and that's the way the social construct of society and reality works according to political power, basically saying power is the ultimate determinant of what the definition of a thing is, then language has no meaning. It especially has no meaning, not only because the whole point of language is to communicate an idea from one individual to another, and we do that through a common understanding, and that common understanding is through language referencing things that are objective. Not only does it completely destroy that, it only allows for what progressives would term an amorphous feeling of what the other person says, but it more specifically destroys how language itself works, because at the heart of the reason why they want to do this is indeed to deceive you. Because again, if you look at how they act, and that's what their ideology is about, how I as an individual can act, and then apply the entire thing to rigorous standards of reason and logic, it is very easy to show how this kind of acting is contrary to reality and not something which is true. It will just lead to disaster. It will just lead to suffering. And so they need an escape hatch, and that escape hatch is, yes, if I get cornered, I will lie my way out of the entire thing because I can redefine words according to how I can win this argument. And so the contrast between a good story and how quote unquote progressive people write a quote unquote story is that a traditional story is, again, a rhetorical argument. And if it wants to be a good story, it needs to be a good rhetorical argument. And that means it needs to be logical. And secondly, it needs to be a reflection of reality. Even the first point, which is it's a rhetorical argument, points back to reality because it points to logic, which is based on reality. Because you're trying to communicate an idea from yourself, the writer, to the reader. You're doing that through language. You're using specific definitions according to the words that you use in order to convey this idea. Those definitions are based upon reality in order for that idea to make some connection. And you need to do so masterfully as a writer so that you can hold the person's attention while at the same time going through this description of reality, which is really why storytelling is an art, and which is also why a good storyteller can follow the story. They can begin a story in X place thinking that they will end up at Y destination, but if you're a good storyteller and you're playing the entire thing out according to the rules of reality, which is really simply the rules of storytelling and the rules of editing, then the story can carry you in a very different direction. And this is the exact opposite of how a quote-unquote progressive storyteller is going to operate. A progressive storyteller must, at their heart, again, unconsciously or consciously, say to themselves, I must protect this one point. I must protect this lie which is at the heart of our ideology. Therefore, we start from that end point of protection of our ideology and work backwards in order to tell a story. And as within an argument itself, where they will constantly redefine things in order for their position to seem tenable, in order for them to so-called win the argument by using equivocation, so it is within a story, which again is a rhetorical argument. They're saying things like continuity go right out the window. Why? Because, again, that would not lead them to their predetermined destination, which is defense of the ideology. Now, that all leads me to the secondary point that I wanted to discuss today. And it's basically why we're looking around us at what is a culture war and seeing entertainment as being one of the massive fronts of this entire war. Why does that occur? Well, that occurs because your quote-unquote progressive storytellers are telling stories in this way. And for the last 50 years, or at the very least for a lot of people who remember the 70s or 80s or 90s, stories were told in the exact opposite way. And here's what I mean. I'll discuss the whole thing according to a story which I've gone over a couple of times on this channel. The biggest storytelling movement within the last 20 years is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That Marvel Cinematic Universe, up until very recently, was based upon older stories from Marvel Comics, and the entire driving engine of why Marvel Comics became so successful was continuity. Jim Shooter, the editor-in-chief for Marvel Comics for a good part of the 80s, and the man who really brought Marvel Comics from a collection of really good storytellers into a well-oiled machine of storytelling, relates the following story over and over again. Jim Shooter worked at DC Comics when Marvel emerged onto the scene. He had worked there for quite some time. He started writing Superman when he was 13, 14 years old because he was mailing in stories and they didn't actually know how old he was. They thought he was much older. But he had been working for DC Comics for quite some time when Marvel came on the scene. And when Marvel started to take over the position as the preeminent comic book company, Jim Shooter went to his editor at the time, because Jim Shooter was writing Legion of Superheroes for DC Comics at the time, and he said to his editor, I think I know exactly why our sales are falling below those of Marvel. It's because those Marvel stories have continuity. DC Comics at that time were instructed to write stories which were standalone stories for every issue of every magazine, so that there might be thousands upon thousands of Superman stories out there, even the Superman title itself, but you could pick them up. You could pick each comic up and read them in any order you wanted because it didn't matter, because there was no continuity between issues. That was their whole plan. That was their business plan. And Jim Shooter said, I want to do continuity with, at the very least, the Legion of Superheroes that I'm writing. And his editor told him, as he relates, no, you can't do that. We don't do that here at DC Comics. Now, he went behind his editor's back and started to introduce continuity into the storylines that he was writing. And he says his editor sort of side-eyed him and said, yeah, I kind of know what you're doing here. But it was not something that caught on at DC Comics. And so what did he do? He moved over to Marvel Comics and became the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics. And when he did so, his focus was on selling as many books as possible through good storytelling, because he had, again, as he relates, some very interesting arguments with the people telling the stories, with the writers for his comics, being an actual editor, not just editor-in-chief, saying, no, that's a bad story. People do not work that way. Reality does not work that way. You have to rewrite this part and that part. Most notably, I always talk about how he did that for the Phoenix Saga, which again is one of the major stories told within the X-Men franchise of movies. But Jim Shooter's focus, both as a small E editor and a large E editor-in-chief, was continuity, because he knew that's how the stories sold. And that continuity, although it did have some play here and there, as all continuity, is based upon telling stories as that old form of a reflection of reality. That is to say, there are rules, even if they are what-if rules for this universe itself. There are rules, you follow the rules. And you certainly follow basic rules of, if this happened in the past, you can't just ignore that it happened in the past. You have to have some continuity of history. There is cause and effect. So that was the first stage, but the second stage was the ballooning, the massive expansion of storytelling itself during that time. And the ability for the people, the audience, who are, let's say, reading Marvel Comics, to engage in that continuity. As our storytelling transmission mechanisms became more and more complex, from books and magazines and comics, to radio and television and movies, and large companies which control these things, which have the ability, at the very least, the ability to direct the storytelling all towards one very specific point. That is to say, one very specific set of continuity rules. The backdrop of storytelling, certainly within the 70s, 80s, and 90s, was this massive expansion of the idea of continuity that holds everything together, both within the stories themselves and how the stories were told, and even how the stories were transmitted to you so that they could be told. And again, since those are the stories that are the basis of the majority of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is the biggest storytelling outlet of the past 20 years, and it, at the very least up until recently, was based upon that strict continuity that was set out within those original stories within Marvel Comics in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, then yeah, there is a massive disconnect between what people see as a good story and what quote-unquote progressive stories are. And wherein, in normal times, people who operate as quote-unquote progressive storytellers operate in a way that they enter equivocation into everything that they do, thinking that they can redefine any word according to defense of their ideology. In normal times, that would be laughed at as bad storytelling. In our time, it has become a major front in a culture war because of that massive push and expansion of continuity within storytelling over the last 50 years. And even more, on top of all of that, they decided to do it according to stories that were dependent upon a heroic ideal. Which again, as I always talk about, heroism itself leads back to the very basic foundation of logic and reality. And since, as I talked about, that basis is the divergent point for your quote-unquote progressive storytellers, when they try to tell a story about heroes, they're actually describing villains. And nowhere, for me anyways, was this more apparent when Marvel did a podcast, Marvel Comics itself at marvel.com, wherein they introduced, as they said, the next great generation of storytellers for Marvel Comics. And what did those four women, because they were all women, talk about in how they create so-called a good story? Well, they talked about writing villains. They talked about how they idolized villains. Why? Because villains, as they said, were freer to do whatever they wanted to. Heroes, they said, were subject to acting within a box. That box, of course, is morality, so they like to write villains better. And it all comes back to that very same point. They like to write villains better. They portray these characters who are supposed to be heroes as villains because they're freer to do whatever it is they want to do. Which goes back to what? Which goes back to their erroneous definition of what liberty is, which is at the exact heart of their entire ideology. It is the prideful and flawed idea which is at the heart of any true villain. And it is the idea that I don't have to follow what reality says, because reality will bend to my will. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description for my 3 graphic novels which are constructed according to a system of merit, with characters and storylines that focus on true traditional heroism. You're looking at some of the beautiful art from those graphic novels in the background. And as I said, I will be playing one of the trailers for one of my graphic novels in just a moment when I finish speaking, to give you more of an idea of what the stories are like. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.
An age ago, the beating heart of our people was a king who knew only victory. He wanted nothing more than an honorable death on the battlefield. Yet, none could match him, and so he wandered the earth, becoming lost in time and tide. Then we too lost our honest purpose, while silk-clad men sat upon the throne. But tremble now, all cities that lay under the stars, for out of the shadows and mists of the land of promise, our courage has been rekindled, our heart has returned, and the world will burn.